Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let all men know. Let all men know your forbearance. The Lord is at hand. Have no anxiety about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Suzanne and I are preparing to have a wood stove installed in our house in the next couple of weeks because our furnace is so old and creaky and the price of fuel oil is so high. As we prepare for the wood stove, I'm remembering all the work that it's going to be, but I'm also remembering the joy of sitting in front of a fire. One of the great pleasures in life, as far as I'm concerned, is walking out of the cold into a room warmed up by a wood stove, walking in with your ears numb and your nose cold, unable to feel your fingers, and as often as not, a cap soaking with rain and a wet jacket, and walking over to the stove and just letting yourself steam there for a while, turning first your front and then your back to the stove, holding your hands above the stove and letting the heat radiate into them, eventually taking off your wet things, hanging them on a string or a nail near the chimney to dry, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the stove as water drips from a cap onto the stovetop. Then pulling up a chair and just sitting by the fire, taking off your boots and stretching your toes out toward the stove door, staring at the flames if you're lucky enough to have a stove with a window. Just sitting there and letting the warmth seep into you until eventually you either fall asleep pleasantly or feel strengthened enough to go on with your other work. Of course, I've also been remembering what it will be like to start crafting firewood again. It's one thing in early fall to cut the trunks and branches of fallen trees into smaller pieces and then cart them away to my backyard, or to buy firewood wherever I can find it and start building a wood pile near the house. It's quite another thing in winter to shape those pieces into logs that fit the stove in length and width, to split the logs into halves and quarters. In the fall, when I am gathering wood, I don't pay much attention to the individual pieces. But when I split a log in winter, I look at it closely. Some species of wood split more easily than other species, and so I try to identify the wood as I prepare to split it. Is it oak, maple, locust, elm? Then I look for the natural cracks, the angle through the center where the log already wants to divide. I look for where branches entered the trunk and the wood is knotted together. I think about whether I need to select some wood to start the fire and get it hot, or wood to burn slowly overnight. I remember learning from my dad about wood from a splitter's point of view, that elm is nearly impossible to split but burns hot if you can fit it into the stove, that locust splits pretty well and is good for holding a fire when the wood is green, that walnut splits well but never gets very hot. When you have a big wood pile like my dad had when I was young, judging with what ease or difficulty I could split a piece of wood was part of the territory of filling the wood box. How much time did I want to take splitting the wood anyway? Enough time to get out the sledgehammer and the wedges and try to get through some of that elm? Or just enough time to split some of the easy locust and oak? My own wood pile, when I've had one, has always been smaller than my dad's. My options are limited for what wood I choose to split and when. If a log is in my pile, I do my best to split it. But I still have that old curiosity about how easy or difficult it's going to be to split a log. After the type of tree the wood comes from, structure is the next most important variable. Is this a section of straight branch or trunk, or is it a place where two parts come together? If it's a straight piece, I aim the wedge for the center, and depending on the wood, it more or less falls apart. But it's never that easy if I'm dealing with a log where two parts have come together. I've learned to split around the junction where a branch meets the trunk, to whittle the log down by splitting the edges away. And there are times when two trunks join together that the log can be split if the wedge is placed where the sapwood from one trunk just touches the sapwood from the other trunk. I look down at the top of this log and I see two dark circles separated from each other by rings of lighter wood. At the place where the rings of lighter wood begin to touch each other, that's where I can place my wedge to split the log. But when I look down at a log and see the darker wood not as two separate circles, but joined together in something like a figure eight, when the two dark circles have grown into and through one another, that's when I give up on splitting that log entirely. I've learned through lengthy and frustrating experience that when two trunks come together in that way, when the heartwood fibers have grown into or around one another, that hunk of wood will be unsplittable. It will not be cleaved. I guess every one of us has different images or metaphors for God and for how God works with us. We probably even have more than one metaphor. From some of my long, frustrating days with an axe, I carry a picture in my head of a log with two hearts grown into one another. And that's one of the ways I understand God working with me. I like to imagine that over time, I am letting my heart grow together with God's heart, and I'm letting God's heart grow into me. And then I have an image for what it means when someone tells me that their strength comes from their faith, because I think about how long and hard I can chip away at a log with a conjoined heart. And even though I damage it, I can never destroy it. And it also gives me some way of imagining what I am aiming at when I say that I want to be able to love as God loves. Because part of what I hope will someday happen is that my heart will be so entwined with God's heart that God's response and God's desire will flow naturally through me, and love won't be so hard for me to come by. I think about Eugene Peterson's translation of Philippians 4, of the passage that I started with. Eugene Peterson translates it this way: don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life. I can think about Christ displacing worry and fear at the center of my life, and the way the heart of one tree strengthens the heart of another tree by growing into and through it. The two hearts together are stronger than one, which is especially useful to the weaker heart. And I can use that strength, not just in some distant time and place, but in this world now, for belonging to God in the realm of the principalities and powers. I can rely on that intertwining as I work to be guided by love in all my interactions, to be generous and courageous in a world which spreads the myth that selfishness, greed, and fear are what protect you. But that intertwined heart isn't just there for us in the big moments. It's also there for us in the smaller moments. Suzanne reminded me yesterday that for centuries, the season after the harvest was a time for rest, for taking stock, for repair, a time to check over the equipment, mend the nets and reset the tines, to repair the plowshare and the basket, a time to sit in front of the fire and tell stories during long, long nights. In our century, though, we usually just plow through the time of long nights as though it were no different than any other time, except a little more difficult because the days are so short and the roads are sometimes icy or impassable. And also difficult because we have crammed these shorter days with almost all of our high-intensity holidays: Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's Eve, Valentine's Day, Groundhog's Day, Well, maybe that last one is not so high intensity. And so at a time when nature itself pushes us toward hibernation, we find ourselves with more tasks and more busyness than at most other times of the year. Philippians 4 tells us it's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the center of your life. Standard translations often use the word anxiety that Eugene Peterson has translated as worry. Both of those words, though, tend to imply a large fear, something along the lines of, is a saber-toothed tiger going to come into the cave and eat us all? But I think a lot of our worry, our anxiety, is something that builds up from the accumulation of 100 little dithers. Will there be enough turkey? Can we keep the twins from busting the table when they get into their annual fist fight? Where will we hide the alcohol so that Ben doesn't find it? Can we get the grandkids Christmas presents that they will actually treasure? We know that it's the right thing to do to invite Aunt Mabel over, who doesn't have anyone else, but she is always so negative. Is there any way to prevent her from making the meal unpleasant for everyone? What allows these questions, many of them legitimate relationship issues that demand some creative problem solving, what allows these questions to rise to the level of fear or anxiety is the way they pile on top of one another until they seem insurmountable. But the intertwining of God's heart with our heart can bring peace even to this winter anxiety, because the intertwining of our heart can allow us the rest we need to let the dithering subside and to reclaim the motions of love that lie beneath these multiple worries. In order to claim God's restfulness, though, unfortunately, we need at least a little bit of practice. We need to remind ourselves to step outside in the cold night and gaze at the stars for 5 minutes. We need to remember to open the Bible or some other piece of literature which fills us with awe and gratitude, to open this book at random and read for 5 minutes a day. We need to practice sitting down in a chair and doing absolutely nothing for 5 minutes. We need to practice turning off the news or putting down the newspaper after we've spent half an hour on the day's events. It can be difficult for all of us sometimes, and for some of us all of the time, because for reasons I don't really understand, we all of us seem to have a different capacity for being aware of God's presence. For all of us, though, there are times and seasons when God's presence seems to be withdrawn. And so it can seem unfair or mistaken for me to talk about how the intertwining of our heart with God's heart can change our lives. Nonetheless, I do absolutely believe that God finds a way to speak to every heart without exception. It could be through friendship. It could be through marriage. It could be through music. It could be through mowing the lawn. Somewhere, somehow, God has given you a place of peace and comfort. Your true winter task, in a way, is to return to that place or to find it for the first time. And if all these things prove too difficult, then at least we have meeting for worship on Sundays. Meeting for worship can warm us like a wood stove on a cold and rainy day. We come in out of the cold and sit down and hope to bask in the warmth of God's presence. Just to sit here and let God's care for us, tenderness towards us, let God's encompassing love wrap around us and warm us to our very bones. And sometimes God's tenderness is simply the presence in the pews and on Zoom of these our friends sitting alongside us. And even though it's not the same kind of physical feeling as heat, not most of the time, there is always this place that we can come to rest, to feel God, to regain the peace that allows us to let the dithering slide away and reclaim our souls from fear.